Kia ora tātou. Welcome to the Future Government webinar series. This is the first in a series of 3 weekly webinars, the first being today, the next being on the 10th and the last being on the 17th of June. It's my great pleasure to be invited to be your facilitator today by NZ Tech and Conference, so thank you for having me. Before we get started, I know that most of you are probably very familiar with Zoom by now, but for those of you that are less familiar, we just want to make sure that you know that we can't see and hear you. You can only see and hear me, or you, and our wonderful panelists. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat function, and we'll endeavour to answer those questions. And just so you know, this webinar is being recorded. And finally, just to let you know the important news that the Future Government Series Summit is going ahead on the 20th of August at Shed 6 in Wellington, so that's good news. So without further ado, let's get on today with our webinar, the use of technology to react, respond and combat COVID-19. We're very lucky to have a very esteemed panel with us, and I will ask them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their role and the work they do. We have Shane Hunter, Deputy Director General of Data and Digital of the Ministry of Health, Robin Hartendorp, General Manager NTT, Rachel Milicic, Deputy Government Statistician and Deputy Chief Executive Insights and Statistics at Stats New Zealand, and Lee Flounders, Strategic Advisor at Lunar Network, and finally, Richard Adams, CDU Lead, Spark New Zealand. So welcome everyone. I just want to ask you all just to introduce yourselves, your role, a little bit about the work you do. And being rather old-fashioned, I will say ladies first. Over to you, Rachel.
Kia ora tātou. Obviously I work at Stats NZ, and as has been introduced, I'm currently working in leading the area of insights and statistics. The main focus of my role has 2 aspects. One is how we add value to the data and statistics that we deliver as a department. And then secondly, it's working with our treaty partners and colleagues across government and other sectors in order to unleash the power of data and steward the data assets that we hold. I also know Emma from the AI Forum. I've been for New Zealand, where I'm on the Executive Council.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to pick you out one by one in order on my screen. So Shane Hunter, you are first, please.
Yeah, kia ora. Shane Hunter, yes, DDG for Data and Digital at the Ministry of Health. I've got a fairly broad responsibility. I have overall responsibility for the health sector digital strategy. I have responsibility for a lot of our national systems, for example, the National Health Index, which is a unique number that's assigned to every New Zealander and in some cases tourists, amongst other systems. I also have all the national collections, so all the big data collections that we have nationally, and I have a team of people who do all the coding of that information that supports our obligations to the WHO, plus we do a lot of work with district health boards and others in New Zealand and with Stats, clearly. I have an architecture, standards and security group as well, so we look at the standards across the system. I have an emerging health tech and innovation group, which is probably my passion, I have to say, and also quite heavily involved in data governance and leadership around data governance in New Zealand. So been in the role for about 15 months, and then prior to that was CIO at 3 DHBs, and long history in working in government, including health. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shane. Robin, you're up next.
Good afternoon, Robin Hartendorp. I'm General Manager South for NTT New Zealand Limited. I suppose our role in this and what we do, we service and support over 40 public sector agencies for communications security, internet and collaboration. So I've got to say, in my 47 years in Wellington, I've never quite experienced anything like the last 2 months. I can tell you it wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. So we are truly privileged to be in the age we're in. So look forward to today and the chat we're going to have.
Thank you, Robin. Lee, over to you, please.
Hi everybody, my name is Lee Flounders, and as you can see in my background, I'm not in New Zealand, with this beautiful view, or virtual view, of I'm in the United Arab Emirates. I've spent the last couple of years heading up the digital strategy for the largest bank in the Gulf region and its subsidiary banks. And I am currently here in my capacity threefold. Firstly, as an advisor of a Vietnamese government-backed technology company called Lena Review, which is about promoting blockchain and also blockchain talent to the world out of Vietnam. So that's my primary role. I'm also a beachhead advisor for the New Zealand government. So I'm the technology beachhead advisor for businesses launching, so New Zealand technology businesses launching into the Gulf region, the GCC. I'm also the CEO of a company in California, so I'm between the UAE and the US, or was between the UAE and the US. And I'm also a co-founder of a remote working platform as well that brings together executives, businesses, and recruiters, something that is very, sort of very relevant and growing very fast at the moment. So it's lovely to be here.
Thank you, Lou. That's great. And certainly, last but not least, Richard.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Richard Adams tōku ingoa, no Wellington aho, ke Spark aho e mahi ana, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Richard Adams and I work at Spark based in Wellington. So my role is that I look after the sales and service teams in Spark south of Taupo. And I've been lucky enough, I guess, to work in a few different areas around product and technology, but then working in with customers, both public and private sector. And as Robin said, it's been sort of fascinating. The way that I think NZ Inc. showed up across this whole thing, I think we should all be quite proud of. And so our role as Spark in this is to try and enable both public and private sector so that we can deal with it as well as we can. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you, Richard. So to start with, just to warm us up, I think it would be great just to talk a little bit about each of your experiences and how technology has helped you deal with the new work that COVID has brought, the new challenges and the type of activities you've had to suddenly grapple with. So does anyone particularly want to jump in there and talk about how tech has helped you cope with the ramifications of COVID?
I'm happy to kick things off if you like.
Thanks, Shane.
Yeah, so I guess for us, one of a really fundamental level was we were able to maintain services while the bulk of our workforce essentially worked remotely. You can imagine in health we're a combination of cold-face workers delivering healthcare as well as people providing support and all sorts of services. So yeah, I think that's the big thing for us, is that we were able to sustain business through that period. I guess, Robin, I would say even 5 years ago we would have struggled, not 20 years ago. I actually can't imagine that if we were even 5 years ago, we would have been in the same position. I think that tools like Zoom, Teams, I think the investment that's been made in high-speed internet, and obviously one of the big things that concerned us was would the networks cope? The telcos assured us that the investment in the World Cup probably helped significantly, and we really, I have to say, we didn't really experience a lot of issues at all. If they were, they'd be inside the buildings or potentially at people's homes. I think the other thing for me was that we really understood the value of the data that we had in the system. So I think previously various organisations had a lot of data, but we weren't necessarily sharing it. By bringing that data together, that was a very important enabler for us to manage during the response, and in particular to support us in things like contact tracing, but also modelling and analysis of where the virus may be spreading. The other thing for me that I think it sort of reflects back to being able to provide the business, to do the business of health was that people were able to deliver services in a very different way. So we've been on a journey for years and years to get people to be able to access healthcare remotely. And all of a sudden, literally within 4 weeks, we had general practices doing 70 to 80% of their consults remotely. We had multidisciplinary care provided with allied health and general practice and specialists all working remotely. something that we've been dreaming of and something that all of a sudden came to life. We removed a whole bunch of paper, stuff that we've equally been trying to do for years. Some of that was essentially getting official waivers to some of the regulations, but our challenge, and we'll come on to this, is how we don't revert. But essentially removing paper. And the other thing that I think that we were able to do was there's a number of people out there that are constrained in terms of access, and through things like working with the telcos on what we call zero-rated data, so specific websites and services that would normally utilise your data plan, we were able to offer that for free. We've picked up the bill, obviously, but we were able to, technically enable people to access services and in effect reverse charge it to us. So those are the sorts of things. And then the other thing for me, I'll just add, and then I'll stop there, is that we were able to leverage the work of other agencies. So, for example, education, targeting 80-odd thousand identified homes where people would have no access to technology at all, and by leveraging off their investment and supporting that, we were able to then connect to those people as well. So, I think it was vital actually to our response. And as I say, even 5 years ago, I think we'd have been challenged for a whole bunch of reasons. So, fortunately, we were better positioned now than we were then. Yeah.
So Emma, just to build on what Shane said, I think one of the best things to see as a citizen, forget about who you work for, was actually how both public and private sector came together. And it just shows what we can do in the way that New Zealand's designed when we all gather around a cause. So as you said, Shane, whether it was around what you're doing with contact tracing, whether it was around helping kids get educated, there was so much of that process and red tape that you mentioned that I don't think people just disregarded it, because there's still concerns around security and making sure people are safe. But actually what we saw was people embracing those kind of agile approaches and just getting stuff done. If I reflect on what we had to do, the technology was great. And the first thing was actually to make our people feel safe. So you went right back to the Maslow kind of approach of get people in their homes feeling safe, like they can contribute. And then our next step was, how do we help those essential services? How do we help to deliver for our customers to deliver to their customers? But actually, when I stand back and look at the whole thing, the piece that really, I think, stood us apart, and when you look across in some other countries, was how everyone dropped, whether it was inter-agency or inter-vertical, some of those almost competitive pressures in the past, and just agreed on the outcome. We just got stuff done so fast as a country. It was really exciting.
Great, thank you, Richard. Robin, I'm going to pick on you next.
Yeah, sure. I thought I might give some context to the enormity of what Richard and Shane were talking about. I mean, there are agencies of 4,500 people and 65 officers that had to turn into 4,500 officers in 24 hours. Right. Now, normally agencies are set up with internet capacity and VPN capacity and firewall capacity to cope with their normal ways of working. But when you convert that from 65 officers to 4,500 officers in 24 hours, that requires some goodwill, strength, commitment, collaboration to do that. So we shouldn't overlook the mechanics of making that happen. The other thing that's quite evident through this is that, the adopters of collaboration services have proved beyond doubt that interagency, inter-service provider, interconnectivity is, it's there. It's enabled. It's not a problem. Right? But about COVID, I'm just reading some emails now. We're not out of it. We're still working on it. So, it's we're still improving processes and the way queues run and what things are doing and how they happen, and that's as it should be. It's about getting that gold-plated standard. One of the most formidable things that I observed was a tender released by an agency at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon that closed at 5 o'clock that same afternoon. Which is pretty spectacular. I've never seen that before. The agency was engaged, it understood the industry, it understood what it was looking for, it collaborated well, it gave those bidding an absolute opportunity to get a correct response in, and it was awarded within 2 days. So it just proves that we can create these new normals on a regular basis in time that meets demand. So, yeah, very, very exciting. However, what we must continue to do, and this has happened to us before, it happened in the Christchurch earthquake, so there's some things we needed to put right after that earthquake that we still haven't done. Right? We mustn't take our eye off this way of working. And the reason I say that is, as I said, it wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, and Shane's right, probably 5 or 10 years ago. It will happen again. And I'm almost certain that if it's not another virus, it'll be some other sort of thing that makes us collaborate and work differently. So we must get our house in order. We must keep pushing on. We can't afford the technology to die in our hands. So, a bit of a call out to all those that are involved, to be alert and make sure that we're all doing the right thing at the right pace to keep us present going forward.
Thank you, Robin. And hopefully what we watch on the world stage in terms of how, the ramifications are still high, heavily hitting other countries will keep us that front of mind, hopefully. Rachel, I'll come to you next, if I may.
Thanks for that. I'll just build on some of the points that have already been made. So certainly, again, for us, being able to quickly move into a remote working scenario was really important. One of the other aspects of our needing to respond was we have a field force who are out collecting data from households on their doorstep. So we worked with a number of agencies to stop that activity in consultation with the Ministry of Health, and we will also look to move together in standing that type of activity back up. What that meant in the short term was thinking about other ways that we could collect data from households, so bringing online more use of telephone and other mechanisms to collect, to keep our services going. So that's certainly in terms of how it impacted us, and we've responded. More broadly though, one of the key things that was apparent to us was obviously we need to serve the government's broader needs to respond, but also ensure that we're making enough data and information available to the other sectors in New Zealand so that they can do their own planning and be informed and collaborate potentially with government. So we've had good support from a range of organisations and sort of pretty quickly a data portal which is bringing together more high frequency data than government has probably together released in the last while. So that has incorporated different indicators such as the wage subsidy scheme, the take-up of that, different statistics relating to COVID itself, and also a number of economic indicators as well. So things like our trade data, what's actually happening with imports and exports. And we know from engaging with some of the bank economists that by being able to stand up a weekly trade series and give some insights as to what was happening with our exports, that was seen as contributing to a lesser fall in the New Zealand dollar. So that's a really tangible outcome. One of the other things I'd be interested in, certainly from the other panellists as well, is one of the things that occurred to me in response to thinking about COVID is just how quickly the scale with the speed with which this phenomena sort of has hit countries, and that the traditional ways that we would respond are just not fast enough. And actually, we need digital and data, and we need to harness that in order to have a chance to make decisions quickly enough and make sure that those decisions are of sufficient quality, that we are doing the right things as a country. So I think that's something that as we move out of COVID, we could think more about, and is that a comparative advantage for New Zealand? Can we harness it in a way that puts people first, people at the centre of what we're doing, but also recognises that the world that we're living in, it's COVID this year, what could be in the future that would mean if we go with our traditional ways, we just won't be quick enough, and the damage, as we've seen, can be tragic.
Thank you, Rachel. And Lee, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Emma.
More experience.
So I think I'm going to take two and try and do this relatively briefly. I'm going to take two components there. I just want to follow on from what Rachel was saying around the data component, and then also just go at a macro level internationally, the kinds of things that I've seen and the trends as well. So first and foremost, just coming back to Rachel, I completely agree around the freeing up of open data. So businesses and governments having a modern architecture, having open APIs to be able to share information is a really, really critical component. I think the businesses that have really suffered have been the businesses that haven't had an open architecture to be able to interact, and the same with governments as well. So we've seen this in the UAE. So I definitely, Rachel, you're bang on there. That's a really critical enabler. If you didn't have that infrastructure in place, you had a lot of challenges. So that's first and foremost. But then at a macro level, I think, and I'm hearing this, I'm in a couple of government forums here in the UAE, and also assisting with a few things in the US. And the one thing I do want to stress is that what we see internationally is the challenges are homogenous. So they're, the challenges that you faced in New Zealand, they're the same things that I've heard in working groups here in the UAE. Vietnam, and also the US. So those challenges are not unique. And they're very much broad across government and businesses. However, the outcomes from those challenges have been different, and the ways that businesses and governments have approached it. However, there's some trends. So I just wanted to kind of outline a couple of notes that I've made here around the trends that we've seen, that I've seen that have been not unique across the businesses that I work with. Businesses in Japan, whether we're working with, say, some of the large investment companies like SoftBank Investment, whether you're working with FMCG, F&B here in the UAE, or fintech, like my fintech company in the US. So first and foremost, I think there's six key notes that I've made, is that COVID has sped up digital transformation. That's pretty obvious, and the need to do digital transformation. I was lucky enough to be involved in the largest digital transformation here in the UAE for a financial services company, 1 billion dirhams, and that bank was ahead of all of the other banks. Now COVID has sped up this digital transformation. Many of you would have seen a meme going around on LinkedIn that says, what sped up your digital transformation the most? Was it your CFO, your CRO, your CEO, or what have you, or was it COVID-19? And COVID-19 has really done that. So the components of digital transformation that we've seen is, really focusing on STP, so straight through processing, being able to interact digitally with your customer base or your employee base. Coming back to that point that Shane and Robin were talking about, and Rachel, around, how do you interact virtually? Integration of RPA, so robotic process automation. So how can you use specific technology to automate processes? And I've just seen a question coming through sort of leading into that, the cultural component. So when you take all of the technology out, actually the cultural component is probably the most important part. How do you get people adopting these technologies and feeling comfortable? So we're seeing a cultural shift, which I think is probably the most important part. Then on top of that, you've got the use of artificial intelligence and advanced analytics, something that there's been a trend in place before, but now with the freeing up the data that Rachel was talking about, now it's about AA and AI, applying that to those large data sets. And probably most critical, I think what you're going to see as a trend coming out of this is less about we've seen previously advanced analytics moving then into almost predictive analytics, but really we're moving into that next stage of what we call prescriptive analytics. And that's really the next stage of artificial intelligence. We're starting to see that happen here in the UAE. So I think that's going to be really the big winner out of this, is really prescriptive, the advancement of artificial intelligence. And then lastly, and probably the thing that affects the people who are probably most disenfranchised with what's happened with COVID-19, that's whether it's at a government level or an employer level, will be really around the reskilling or the need to reskill. You see in the media, we've got Emirates Airlines captains who are stacking shelves, and I've read similar examples in New Zealand and Australia of pilots having to do roles that they were not familiar with. Well, that's a microcosm of what's happening in the wider employment environment. So you've got people who have gone from offline jobs or traditional, whether it's middle management or sales roles, really now needing to reskill. And that reskilling is in AI, digital, RPA, all of the things that we think of traditional roles now moving into this new economy. So I think we're seeing probably most importantly, and I'm rattling on a little bit, is that the two key things are the change in culture and also a need for complete reskilling into a new digital economy as well.
Lee, can I ask you a question, just given your sort of international experience on this? One of the things that we've seen locally has been a lot of the technology conversations you've mentioned, whether it's around AI, whatever kind of version of that there is. In my mind, there's two key things. One is mindset or culture, as you say, the can-do, we're going to find a way to get through this. And I think that's almost beaten technology on every occasion. But where technology is being required or an essential part of it, having companies or agencies who have the policies ready to act has been the challenge that we've and we've seen some fantastic examples where we've gone in, I guess, like a minimum viable product approach. We've said what's sacrosanct around policy is normally around identity, access management, security. So if you put those into one corner, do we have the policies and the procedures in place so that we can take advantage of the technology? That feels like something that New Zealand Bank has to work on, because otherwise we can have the best mindset and capability, but we restrict ourselves from being able to implement. What are you seeing overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually it comes, I can try and narrow it down to two key specific things. I don't think it's unique to New Zealand or anywhere else in the world. There's actually two critical components here when we're looking at the advancement of these types of technologies. So first and foremost, coming back to culture, but also cost as well. So that cultural component, if we look at, say, what's happened with COVID-19, the businesses that have thrived or the governments that have thrived are the ones who've had a really good, firstly, they've had the underlying architecture, so they've invested in that. And then secondly, they've had really good DRP platforms. So they've had good disaster recovery plans. And so they've been able to implement, either shadow C-suite or shadow executive and be able to implement on top of the modern architecture ways to solve the problem. So I think culturally, you talk about open data, or you've got to have in the business sector, you need to have good data protocols. You need to have open-minded security teams, open-minded risk teams and compliance teams. And that obviously goes into the government side as well, a willingness to open the data. So I think that comes back to the culture. But most importantly to me, it's cost. So previously at an enterprise or government or even small, startup or SME side, the challenge has been around what we think of digital transformation. The challenge has always been around cost and looking at an X return. So people have previously, whether it's CEOs or CFOs or at a government level, they've looked at digital transformation and change as an X return. So they've said, okay, if we do this, that will give us a X5 return. And I've seen this, like I say, at the largest bank here in the Gulf region, constantly when you have an initiative, say, around implementing data, whether it's around offsetting risk or providing a better consumer experience, it always comes down to an X5 return. What can you get out of doing this transformation or this project? Now, what COVID has shown is that now it's not about an X5 return, it's about the very survival of your business. So I think that, and we've seen this with purely offline businesses or businesses that having a website is you're not a digital company. Having a website to serve your base is not being digital. You need all of those other infrastructures in place, identification, open data, et cetera. So I think it really comes down to cost and culture. And again, those are generic internationally. So whatever the challenges that you would face at a government or a business level in New Zealand are not unique to anywhere else. And so I think what you'll see now and what I've seen is a move away from an X return model of if we apply this digital transformation or this component, it will give us this. Now it's about actually how do we service our client base or our employee base better to be able to actually just stay in business as well. But it's a great question.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I might just add something if I can to that. I do think a lot of companies have worked out as a result of COVID that what they thought might be good enough, say their web presence simply wasn't good enough at all. So, I mean, I know for me personally, that I found myself looking to, because I was forced to buy online. I was now shopping online, and I needed more information than I typically would get, because I could go into a store and touch it and feel it and read it, and the lack of that information meant that I would then go and do a search to get the spec, and inevitably I'd end up buying off someone else. So, because they had the answers and they had the buy now button. So I think it exposed, for businesses the point that they need to actually invest even further, because this will be aspects of the new norm.
Sorry, and can I just quickly add that to Shane's point as well? I completely agree. And it is, digital transformation is not having a website. It is, to Rachel's point, to Robin's point, it's around the core infrastructure. It's being able to have a team that can operate in an agile manner, that has a flat structure, that is using modern tools like Jira, Asana. It's collaboration. It's a completely different way of thinking. It's straight through processing. It's using process automation to remove people from the business, but bringing in the right people to be able to execute. It's a completely different mindset. It's integrating with other businesses. It's open information. It's just not having a website, and that's probably the key thing that communicating to businesses. Transformation is not getting an IT or an IT company to come and do your website. It's much more than that.
So Shane, if I may come to you. So from my experience in AI, health is set to benefit from data and AI beyond imagination. Do you think the lessons learned during the COVID scenario is enough to carry through innovation and commitment to taking steps further into new technologies to deliver new health services?
Get off mute, that will help. Absolutely. I think we've all mastered the art of hitting the mute button really fast, by the way. When we all started on Zoom, we were a bit slow finding it. Well, actually, that's a really good point. So I made a note down here before. We have a new confidence. One is we've got confidence that we can actually do some of this stuff, and two is we've got confidence that we, so technically we can do some things. And two is we've got confidence in people that we can actually use the technology. So one of the point about the technology's been sitting here for a long time. What do we need to do to get the behaviours to adopt it? I think we've shoehorned to some degree tools like Zoom into the health system, but people have actually embraced it because it's really simple to use, and that's something that if you spent time in health and you look at health IT, it's designed in the 80s. It still looks like it was built in the 80s. It's not easy to use at all, and we don't have a particularly solid sort of mobile experience. But there are various strategies in place to try and get there. But I think we've been forced to make the leap. I think people have found the tools are easy to use, and I think they want more. So our challenge to sustain it is to actually continue to enhance on building on what's there, and I guess, as Robin said, not let up. From a data point of view, and from a system architecture point of view, we've been heading down a path over the last 12 or so months around more of an interoperable ecosystem than the big single electronic health record, which has been the nirvana for the last 20 years. But A, I don't think would ever be achieved, and B, we don't need to do it. What we need to do is interconnect with all these different trusted sources. And we need to have APIs, and we need to promote innovation, and we need to have security and privacy and all those sorts of things factored in. I think that we had aspects of this in place, but not enough in place. We had enough in place to see the opportunity, and now we know what we need to do and to move quite quickly to solve that going forward. On the data front, it would be fair to say that the ministry for years has been known as a data cemetery. It's a place where data goes to die. We collect it all up, we store it all, we produce reports, very specific reports, but we don't necessarily make it available to the system. We've learned through COVID that actually the more that we can get the right sharing of data, the more powerful it is. And if I think about COVID, there's a lot of focus in the media on tracing. It's not just about tracing. Actually, what we need is data that tells us what's going on, that might predict that we actually might have a case where we've got community transmission. So how do we actually get ahead of the game? And then at the other end of the scale, having basically traced someone and all their close contacts and got them into isolation as fast as possible, if we use data, we can actually work out how we respond beyond just tracing and isolation. So, for example, how big a deal is this close contact? If we're talking about the Matamata wedding or some of the other clusters that we talked about, where did they happen? What's the profile of the population there? Are we talking about older people who are at risk? Are we talking about people with comorbidities that puts them at risk? You know, what is it about the population? You know, are we talking about high density housing? All that stuff comes together and tells you how you might respond or get the community to respond. So the power of data, in my view, is well, it's become really obvious through COVID, and we need to do much more to leverage it, but not just health data. There's a lot of other data that we need to bring together to actually allow us, and I think it'll be important because until we have a vaccine, we have to learn to coexist with this thing, and we're going to be forced to coexist with it because we're going to have to open the borders. So the power of the ecosystem, the data, the analytics, the predictability is really, really going to be an important part of our arsenal.
Couldn't agree with you more. I'm a big fan of open data, and Rachel certainly knows this. I think it's a must that the government can share data, and then we find a way to share it more broadly. Rachel, do you have anything to comment on increasing data sharing and openness, certainly, let's say, within government and between government agencies?
I mean, so certainly that's been a focus through the government open data program for the last, I think, about 5 to 7 years. And so while we've made some progress, there are more data sets available. We know that there's still a lot more work to do. And I think what we also need to recognise is how do we make sure that we have the trust and confidence of New Zealanders as we open data, when we think about what data we're opening and why. What it's also exposed is we could make a lot of data sets available, but are they the ones that we actually need in order to make a difference? And so it's certainly highlighted, there's been a number of, on two levels, there's been a number of conversations about vulnerable populations, about Māori and iwi communities, as well as Pacific peoples communities. And we know that they are, particularly for government, two areas where we don't have enough data. And we do need to think about how do we increase the amount of data. But we need to do that and think about data governance. We need to do that in a way that works with those communities, in order to make sure that we understand what their needs are, and also that we steward that data in an appropriate way, so it's doing things with people, not just for them. So I think that's certainly, we have more work to do on those two fronts. There's a number of, I think, foundational pieces that we've been working on as government to try and improve those things. But there's definitely more work to do, and COVID has highlighted some of the gaps that we have in areas where we haven't got a lot of depth. And we recognise, there's a role for the private sector as much as government. What data does New Zealand collectively hold, and how do we share that effectively, but in a way that builds trust and confidence. We've certainly seen that through this, through our response collectively. There's been a lot of trust in the response itself, but I think we need to just be mindful that it could be a bubble. It could be just related to this particular situation and context. And if we make assumptions about what that might enable us to do coming into the recovery, we could be disappointed. So it does come back to the attitudes, the behaviours, the practices that we put in place that continue to build on the trust and confidence that we've gained through our work on COVID and beyond.
I agree. And
on that, Emma, if it's all right. So, Rachel, to your point, I think the private sector also, we need to play a role in this, and Shane mentioned it before. So if you think about businesses like with Spark and NTT, one of the things that we're seeing is a different way that people want to consume technology. And this is not necessarily about the type of technology, it's around the speed at which we have to deploy, the elasticity around the cost models. And I think we all need to place some bets, to be frank, around what those platforms of the future are going to be, so we can have all the interoperability that Lee talked about, and we can start to use those automation processes. One of the challenges I think we have collectively as a country, though, is the age of the data when we're doing the propensity modelling. So to have access to data which is as close to real time, which then obviously opens up the whole trust and interoperability conversation. We're going through, as many others will be at the moment or on this call, our planning for the next couple of years around our capital investment. And we know we have to look at investing differently, but what we need is to make sure we're all operating from a data set that we believe in and that we can use as a reference point. That, I think, is something really important for NZ Inc. overall. So the work that you're doing to make that available is just so important right now as we place those bets.
Yeah. Robin, anything to add on public and private? We've heard a lot about how good we are at collaborating in New Zealand, but moving forward, unlocking data both held publicly and privately. Any thoughts on that?
Three things I'll talk about. I think the difference between digital and infrastructure is pretty important to understand. Scaling legacy systems at speed has not been digital. That's technology. So when you add 1,000 more help desk people, or when you add 50 more technologists, that's not being digital. And we've talked about RPA or CPA and AI. Those are the things that help you get those economies really quickly, and that's been digital. And on the data side, it's always amazed me in the social services sector and youth justice sector in New Zealand, the only person that has access to all the data, at the end of the day, is the coroner, right? And he gets it unheralded, right? So we're all right at that end. The collaboration at the front end's always been a wee bit difficult for us. There's plenty of people got in the way. So maybe we should start thinking about what the coroner needs, and maybe we won't need to use them as often around the collaboration of the data. And on culture, it's interesting, having worked for a significant multinational which was able to collaborate really effectively, with over 100,000 people from many miles away. You could certainly innovate and collaborate, but you couldn't execute. Execution is what culture is all about. That's how things get done. And it was brought home to me last week talking to a senior executive in the public sector where two people going into lockdown, two separate people in the same organisation, were on performance improvement programs. And they were, unwittingly to them, they were bad performers. During lockdown, they become star performers. And what was drawn from that is that their relationship with their leader was toxic. He was the poor performer. So you get different responses under this new way of operating. You get different behaviours, different outputs. You certainly connected a lot more, whether you're that much more productive, I don't know. You spend a lot of time talking and collaborating. But like I said, the culture comes back to the execution, and most of that needs to be done on the ground with people. So.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to one of our questions that have come through. Shane picked up on it slightly, but if anyone else wants to jump in, and that is that notwithstanding the awesome efforts of many professionals to get up and running, working from home remotely, but generally the technology has been sitting there for a long time. What hasn't been there are the behaviours to adopt it. How might we get these behaviours shifts during normal times? So are we going to be exhausted at the end of this? Are we going to lose this energy? Are we going to be fed up with this change? And how do we combat that? Anyone wants to jump in?
I think the biggest risk is that we get complacent and we think that we've nailed it when we haven't. We've only really just started the journey. It's just that we've accelerated it. So, I think we've got to, to some degree enhance whatever we've implemented it, because as I mentioned before, we will have shoehorned certain things in because we had to at speed. And I think the other thing, which I think has been touched on by several of us, is just is going to be around the cultural aspects of how we actually operate differently. I actually read something yesterday where someone was saying that remote work, as a remote worker, you're not really a team. This person was very pro getting people back and working in the office. And I'm sure there's going to be some pressure on government in particular to do that, because otherwise Lambton Quay is going to be pretty empty and we're going to have a few shops that are struggling. But the reality is that people have found, I mean, we've surveyed our staff, and I think it's pretty consistent across government, that I think 79% of our people actually want a hybrid model. So they don't want to be back in the office full time, but they also don't want to be working remotely full time. So if we're going to accommodate that, then how do we remain connected? And how do you create the water cooler conversation when actually we're just not there? So there's a lot of challenges, I think, to sustaining it. It's not just technical, but cultural as well. But we've also got to, I think we've got to think about those people that aren't necessarily going to be able to participate either in whatever the new normal looks like. So whether that's reskilling, as we mentioned, or whether that's dealing with the sort of digitally excluded, so to speak. There's just a lot of work that we need to carry on. I just think we've proven a bunch of things, but we're by no means out of the woods, so to speak, in terms of continuing the transformation.
Hey, Emma, can I just add in as well? Coming back to that specific question around, the technology's been there. Why has it taken so long? And the reason I just want to comment on this, I think there's a lesson, but there's also something coming as well that we need to be very careful of. Now, my view is that the primary reason why these tools haven't been used is there's a desire for control. So whether that's at a government level or a business level, so business level might be, we want to control the staff, and that could be around, having them actually at a physical office, or it might be around open data, it might be around security, it might be around compliance. So here in the UAE, you have, so prior to COVID, Zoom and Skype and WhatsApp video, they're all banned. You can't use them. So you had to actually put a VPN on and work around to be able to do that. And even the bank that I was doing the digital transformation on, we had Teams, Microsoft Teams, but you couldn't actually use it because the compliance team wouldn't let you use it. So it actually came down to control, whether that's control of information at a government level here in the UAE, not wanting these open, whether it's anywhere from open source through to cloud technologies being used, and then at a business level wanting to control the information from the perception of compliance or what have you. So I think previously that's happened. Now we've had this reason where it's just, well, we've got to be productive, right? We've got to interact. So let's adopt all of these technologies to be able to do that. And Robin, you were talking about, I think Robin or Shane, you were talking about the clunky architecture that say, Shane, you were talking about the clunky architecture that you have in the health system, right? But once you bring a Zoom on, everyone's like, yeah, we'll use it because it's easy, and that comes down to the customer experience. What we're going to find though is give us a breath and opportunity to breathe and go, right, this thing's over, we're good, maybe it's going to come again, but we're all good. We go back to whatever the new norm is. Then the compliance at a government level, at a business level, the compliance guys are going to come in, the security guys are going to come in, the girls who are managing ops risk, etc. You're going to see this kind of layer come on top. The managers are going to come in and they want their teams back, etc. And then obviously at a government level, you're going to see maybe it's around data control, and we've gone too far. So it's that pendulum. So I think we need to be very careful, and watching those conversations around, oh, well, it's hosted on the cloud. No, we need to be careful. We need to now interrogate this. Where's our data go? Of course there needs to be due diligence, but I think you're going to see the pendulum kind of come back, and also institutions wanting to hold the technology internally rather than externally. So, now we're all using Zoom, right? Well, where's this information going? No one's really asking that, but someone's going to. And then there's going to be these challenges around, okay, well, do we put in draconian measures? So I think that there's that conversation's coming, and that's actually the fundamental reason why large corporates or governments haven't adopted this technology previously. And yes, that question is bang on, but it's because of all of those layers that we have in that have been removed because of COVID-19.
Yeah, and hopefully, we need to have those conversations, don't we, in order to progress, and hopefully there'll be some certainly more urgency to get those conversations had, and pathways moving forward. We've got a question here specifically for stats. So stats have had a big role to play in enabling this collaboration and brackets ethical sharing of data. What do you need to change to do your job more effectively? Over to you, Rachel. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Can you just repeat the question?
Yep. So stats have a big role to play in enabling this collaboration and ethical sharing of data. What do you need to change to do your job more effectively?
So, I mean, I think one of the things that it has come through is coordination, and it does. I think for a number of departments, we will have to take stock and just have a look at, what has worked, what have we done differently, just building on the other points, and then, what are the perhaps new mechanisms that we need to put in place, and how can digital enable that? So certainly finding more ways to make what we're doing as government more transparent, and some of that can be as simple as just reporting on some aggregate things that we're doing, just to give a flavour of where things are at. I think often we go to, it'll have to be a whole load of detail, but actually the insight for some people might just be understanding in aggregate how many initiatives have we got going on in these spaces, even if it isn't some of the detail. I think too, one of the areas that we will be reflecting on is the risk appetite, and what COVID has done is shift people's perception of what the risks, what those trade-offs are. And I think as we move to a new normal, I mean, certainly like a number of others, that's what we've been talking about. We're not going back. We're actually going to a new normal and thinking about how do we embed in a number of the things that we've seen. Certainly in terms of relationships, we've established a number of relationships. We have to work a lot harder to think about our engagement model and how do we do that effectively to sustain those, because they have been critical, and that's certainly something that we want to maintain and build on. I think there'll be aspects picking up, things like standards, data specifications, content, in the context of like a contact tracing app. If there's a number of them and we need to join those data sets together in order to understand what's happened, the interoperability of that data is going to be critical. So I think working with a number of agencies and leveraging the collective understanding and knowledge we have to put some of those things more in place. So there's a number of things in the space of interoperability, things we need to do in terms of relationships and better engagement models to support that ongoing, and certainly how do we work with agencies to open data up a lot more and think about what the risk appetite actually is. We're not always, we don't always create that compelling case for the opportunity. It's much easier to fall back on the number of, how do you manage all the risks? But as we've seen, the more that we can tell that compelling case of what the opportunity is, what the benefits are, what happens if we don't do it, that's often overlooked as well. I think that will also help us in our work going forward.
I agree, and I've been saying for years, if you don't do anything with new tech and AI, at least sort out your data. Clean it, get it. You don't know what you do with it, at least clean it, get it ready. And I think the more people that do that, the more data sets can be joined, and the more they can benefit multiple groups within a trusted agreement, which is got to be a good thing. I'm going to move on to another question. How can government support the new skills growth? We've seen free training for trades to be announced. What about AI, ML, analytics, CX, etc.? Does anyone want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I'll just do this very, very quickly. I saw that. I saw some of the social media comments around that. And I certainly can't make comment on, but it seemed like an oversight that there wasn't any investment in that space. I mean, here in the UAE, we have a Ministry of Artificial Intelligence. It's that big. I mean, people are that focused on upskilling whether it's the Emirati talent here or bringing in talent to train up. I mean, I only briefly saw the comments and the focus that it was very much on sort of, primary and traditional trades. And I was like, wow, I could not believe. And I'm assuming that either that's an oversight or that there's another layer there where there's some focus on that. But to me, that just doesn't make sense at all, because surely that's where there's has to be significant investment in skills and upskilling, because it's scalable, it's international. You're creating talent that can not just be applied here in New Zealand and the economy reap the benefits, but also can be applied internationally as well. So there's a massive opportunity there. But like I say, I can't really comment because I don't know if there's some other underlying components there.
Richard, anything to comment? Are you doing anything around retraining workforces or talent growth or any of that? Is that anything that you do at Spark?
Yeah, there is, and there's probably a couple of angles to it. I guess the first is where we try and bring through graduates and people who have grown up in, I guess, that age, for want of a better term, who this is native to. And so that's been an investment area for a while. Within the Spark group, there's some areas like Curious who are around that big data and analytics side of things. But actually, I think the area that might be most interesting is more around how we work across industry. So we've been doing some work with some of the larger ministries where we will jointly fund and put people into roles so that we can start to do that skills-based training. And there's been some really good examples, and it all sits under, I guess, that sort of public good approach. So I think if we agree that we need to do it together, then we'll probably do better. The challenge in New Zealand, as we all know, is sometimes having the scale to develop those centres of excellence. It's something we want to do more of, and it feels like the public sector in particular is more open to it. So I think we need to continue.
Completely agree. It's something we need to address with more urgency. And actually, Lee, I'm not sure it is an oversight. It's just something we haven't got to yet. So, and that also needs to be examined. We are to continue keeping up with the pace of things. I'm just conscious of time, everybody. Does anyone want to say anything to finish off?
I've got a wee bit of a plea. What normally happens after we've had one of these events, we all spend a lot of money. There's a high volume of activity, and everybody's got their shoulder to the wheel, making sure things happen. And having walked the Lambton Quay for the last couple of weeks now, and I'm starting to notice the tumbleweed, which is a bit distressing. I've also started to notice a few contractors being let go or released from some large agencies. Now, like I said, what tends to happen is central government tends to tighten up its sphincter quite well. They've got to pay some of this money back. They've got to reorganise themselves properly. They'll probably make some agencies now live to their budgets, but it was all go for a couple of months. Some of these contractors are not rich or our people. They are contractors that work directly for the agencies. Some of these contractors do the heavy lifting that make the change. And if you release them to the wild, the heavy lifting will stop and we'll go calamitous here in the next 6 months. So my ask generally of the core public sector agencies is you keep some of these projects going, you keep doing the good works, you don't back away from it, because that's not going to help anybody. You're going to move a whole lot of people to the other side of the counter, and you can forget all the trades training you like. You're just going to put a whole lot of people out of work. So get the essential things done, keep people going. That's my ask.
Thank you, Robin. Anyone else before you wrap up? Great. Okay.
Probably just.
Sorry, Shane.
Just a last comment from me. I mean, I agree, Robin. It is quite concerning. I just suspect there will be some casualties because people won't have the skills where we need them, and there'll be areas that we're gonna go after. But I do think the government. I mean, we're only talking 10 or so weeks right now. So we've been massively into response. We're now into recovery and then into transformation. So I think the challenge is, how quickly can we move and minimise the damage? And certainly the government will continue to to try and prop businesses up. But I think we've all got to get smart around how we adjust to this, because some things are just going to have to stop, unfortunately. But I think the skills development and the support to New Zealand companies that potentially can provide something that is not only useful for New Zealand, but obviously into a global market. And the beauty of digital is it can be done globally. So closed borders doesn't prevent. That's where I think our opportunities lie, and it will come down to speed. And I think there's an element of literacy around digital and data and the opportunity that I think we've got a bit of work to do quite quickly at our board and executive level as well, because I don't know how many understand the art of what's possible, and I don't know how many understand yet what we're going to need.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, for those that are losing their jobs, we've got to remember that this is an opportunity for some retraining and some repositioning of skills, and some clever curriculums to help those people shift into different areas of work. And we have to remember immigration is going to be locked down for a long time, and it's more reason to retrain our people that are willing and wanting to. So thank you all so much for your time today. You've been brilliant, and thank you for sharing your insights with everybody. Thank you to our audience, and thank you for joining us, and we hope that you enjoyed the session.
Why don't you want me?